in this example, I explicitly tell you how I would define variables in given situations. Okay, a lot of times you will have the freedom to pick your variable and make sure it is understood by whoever is reading it. And so right now we're just going to talk about how I would represent things. Let's call H the number of hours a student in a class spends studying for a test, and T this test score that a student earns. What do you think will happen to T, the test score, as we increase H, the number of hours a student studies? Well, my guess is that if we increase the hours studied, then your test score, that student's test score, will increase from what it would have been had they not studied. So my guess is that as T increases, oopsie, my bad, H for hours, as H increases, I almost used T for time, but actually I used T for test score. As H increases, we expect T to increase. And that's because H, again, represents time studied, hours studying. So as the hours studying increases, we expect T, the test score, we expect the test score to increase as well. Let's do it again. Let's call D the number of days a student misses class during a particular unit. Ruh-roh. And this even happens when you're at home taking an online class or wherever you go to take your online class. I don't know, maybe you're traveling to a hotspot because you're like, man, my internet doesn't work, which is exactly how I was when I was even post student life for me. Oh, there goes my dog again. There must be a duck in the yard. Anyway, I had terrible internet about 6 years ago. I would call Comcast like every day because I'm that person. So maybe you're at a hot spot doing this. Nonetheless, if you miss a day, it's so easy to fall behind. Try not to do that. Stay on your routine. Let's call D the number of days a student misses class, and let's say T represents the unit test score. What do you think will happen to T, the test score, as we increase D, the number of days missing class? Skipper. Let's see. What is happening? Increasing D. As D increases, we expect T to decrease. Going down. Okay, and again, I feel like this is all about using a well-defined variable here. D, days absent. Oopsie, absent. And expect T, test score. Okay, so sometimes, by the way, this speaks to priority. So people who don't necessarily prioritize school miss school for random things, and then their test scores suffer. And I wouldn't necessarily, that's, you're adults, it's your prerogative, it's your life. So as D increases, or as the days absence increases, we expect the test score to go down. You bet. Okay, let's look at number 3. Number of shoes. Here's a letter S. Okay. Represent the number of shoes a student owns with the letter S. And we'll keep calling the person's test score T. What do you think will happen to T as S increases? So as S increases, we have no expectation on T. It's questionable, I would say. So, I mean, you could make the claim that there's some kind of, that maybe if a person has a ton of shoes, then they have money to buy other frivolous things like fancy phones and extra textbooks and pay for tutors. But actually, this says sometimes I've met people who, have tutors, but they have only one pair of shoes, and they have a lot of pair of shoes and do not even consider the idea of getting a tutor. So I would say that the number of shoes has very little to do with this. So let's see. It's more about motivation, that test score thing. So S represents what? Number of shoes. And T, test score. So just to write it out in terms of actual meaning of the variable, as the number of shoes increases, we have no expectation on the test score. I mean, we just don't know. Which brings me to these, which I actually used these words in section 1.1. And now I'm going to actually write their definitions. Well, at least how I define them. Explanatory or independent variable is manipulated by the researcher. So an independent variable is manipulated by the researcher to see, will the outcome change? And then the response is what happens to the other amount. So the response variable responds to changes in the explanatory variable, and that outcome we record and measure. We record this one too, but we don't measure it. We write it down and we manipulate it. We change it on purpose. This one though, and that's the independent variable. It does what we want it to do or whatever. But this one depends on what we told this independent or explanatory one to do. So the response variable responds to changes in the explanatory. Responds to changes in the explanatory variable. If there is indeed a relationship between an explanatory and a response, and we measure the outcome, and whose outcome we track, we measure it, we write it, and then I have this other thing, which is a statistical term, which I wasn't actually familiar with. I mean, I knew the concept, but I hadn't really been exposed to this language until I took a stats class, which is a lurking variable, which is some unknown explanatory variable that is actually causing things to change in the response, even though we thought it was something else that was explaining it. So it is a variable that caused or correlates with the response changing that was different than how we had defined the explanation to be. So a different explanatory variable, okay, that was not considered. by the researcher. Okay, and I would also say that it affected the outcome, and that's why it's kind of called a lurking variable. It's hidden in the background, and it changes things, but we don't really see it coming. Okay, so a different explanatory variable that was not considered by the researcher, but had an effect of the value of the response variable. Okay, so let's take a look at variables and this example. Kindergartners. Data was gathered at the end of a school year in order to compare the reading skills of two groups of students. One group went to kindergarten for the full day, the other group went half day. After reviewing the data, the half-day students ended up having significantly higher reading skills than the full-day kindergarten students. Number 1. What was the researcher's intended explanatory variable? And let's assign it a letter. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and look at number 2 as well, which is what is the response? So when I think about what was manipulated, I think the time of day. One class was full day and the other was a half day. So the manipulated one, or the explanatory variable, was length of kindergarten day. And let's assign it a letter. I don't care. Let's go with T for time. And then it's saying, what is the intended response to that variable? Well, it looks like what they're looking to look for in terms of a response is reading skills. So response variable or dependent variable is reading skill level of kindergartner. Maybe of a kindergartner. And I don't know, we're going to go with R for reading. Okay, so here we have the explanatory variable. Length of day or length of time in the classroom is explaining the reading skill level as a response to how long you're in class. Or another way is, right, this is independent, so the reading skill level of a kindergartner depends on how long they are in class each day. Number 3 says, name some possible lurking variables in this study. Well, a lot of people usually have a ton of responses to this. So I'm just going to write down a few that come to my mind. First, what if one of these schools had a preschool and one of them didn't? So, okay, one possible variable that wasn't considered in this by this researcher in this study, preschool. So basically entrance. Speaking of entrance, what if one of those schools actually was selective? You know, maybe they actually gave a pretest. And now this idea is a little bit beside me. I am a public school person. I went through public school. My kids go to public school. So you might consider me somewhat of a biased opinion on this. But I definitely think that if one of those schools was selective, they're probably going to have higher reading skill levels because they picked the kids with higher reading skill levels. So, and when I say selective, I'm like, is that a private school that you had to get into? So that could definitely change the outcomes of reading skill levels. Another one is, I would say, economic status. So perhaps, okay, taxes, right? And this has to do a lot when I say this, and this is a hasty generalization. It doesn't apply to everyone, but let's suppose you have a parent. Let's suppose, let's go with mine. I had a single parent, and because my dad died when I was pretty young, and my mom, she had to work a lot to raise, I was the fourth child. There are four of us. So, do you think I got read books to? No way. Only if my oldest sibling was like, oh, I'm going to care for you today. And I mean, seriously, how often does that happen? Anyway, so as kids. So when I say economic status, I'm thinking, did their parents even have the opportunity to read to their kids at night? Just that act alone would change the reading skill level of a kindergartner. Maybe not of a high school student, but definitely upon entrance into school. So, you work in the night shift, where you work in 2 jobs, where you work in 3 jobs, read at night. Okay, so I definitely feel like there are some lurking variables that should be taken into consideration here. Next, and you might have come up with more that I didn't even think about. How might the state use the information in a study like this? Well, I feel like in a study like this, they will decide, oh, by the way, shout out to Census 2020, be counted. They will decide where the tax money goes. And if they're looking at this and they're like, well, that full day really didn't help the reading skills of kindergartners. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe it actually did help the reading level of kindergartners, but instead of just doing the reading skill level, maybe they should have been measuring the change in reading skill level of a kindergartner. So when I think about this study, it just makes me a little bit hot in the head, because I think if I were the researcher, I might have changed this. This is what they actually measured, and this is what they published, and this is what they made decisions based on in terms of whether they should have full day and whether they should have half day. And this was an issue within this study. But in my opinion, the real research should have been measured in change in reading skill level of a kindergartner. Then perhaps you would have actually seen the effectiveness of full day versus half day. And maybe even still yet, there would be these lurking variables. I'm not sure. Be worth a research. Probably has been done. Anyway, how might the state use this information in a study like this? Keep or cut programs. Pretty important. Pretty important. Are we going to keep the full day kindergarten program, or are we going to cut it? Example 5. Reduction in hours. Okay. Actually, what I'm going to go ahead and do is kind of summarize what we've talked about so far, and then I'll start a new video for number 5. We talked about signs making a big difference, and instead of only including words, maybe what we could do, so as we are making good decisions, we collect data and we're going to describe it in a useful way. And now we're starting to describe it in both meaning and variables, and then we draw conclusions from these things. Okay, so, and as we do that, we're really talking about how the cause and effect, or is there a correlation? As one changes, does the other change, or maybe not? Okay, so good research, and then a really good way to actually write down what everything represents.